I watched Richard Holloway shake hands with the chairman of the Architectural Review Committee for what felt like the 100th time in 3 years, and something in my gut twisted. We stood in the cramped conference room of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA building in Scottsdale, Arizona. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead while Richard's company, Desert Verde Landscaping, had just been awarded yet another contract. This time it was for the main entrance renovation, a project worth nearly $80,000. My name is Bryan Garrett, and I had moved to Meadowbrook Estates 2 years ago with my wife after taking a job as an accounting manager at a software firm in Phoenix. The community seemed perfect at first, with its manicured lawns, Spanish-style homes, and promises of maintained property values. But lately, things had felt off in ways I could not quite articulate until that moment. "Congratulations, Richard," I said, forcing a smile as he walked past me toward the exit. He was in his mid-50s, tan from constant outdoor work, with silver hair slicked back and an expensive watch that seemed incongruous with someone who supposedly made their living trimming hedges and planting flowers. "Thanks, Bryan. Desert Verde always delivers quality work. That's why the board keeps choosing us," he replied with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. The thing was, Richard Holloway was not just the owner of Desert Verde Landscaping. He was also the president of our HOA board, a position he had held for the past 4 years. And in those 4 years, his company had won every single landscaping contract put out for bid in our community. Every single one. I lingered after the meeting while other homeowners filed out, watching as Patricia Enright, the HOA secretary, gathered papers. Patricia was a woman in her late 40s with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had been Richard's most vocal supporter on the board. "Patricia, can I ask you something?" I said, approaching the table where she organized manila folders. She looked up, her smile firmly in place. "Of course, Bryan. What's on your mind?" "How many other companies submitted bids for the entrance renovation?" Her smile flickered for just a moment. "I believe there were 2 other bids. But Desert Verde's proposal was the most comprehensive and competitively priced." "Could I see the other bids? They should be part of the public record, right?" Patricia's hand stopped moving. "Well, technically yes, but you would need to submit a formal request to review association documents. We have procedures for that sort of thing." "I understand. I will file that request then." She nodded, but something in her expression had changed. The warmth, fake as it might have been, had evaporated entirely. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, reviewing the HOA's financial statements that were posted on the community website. My wife, Jennifer, set a cup of coffee beside me and peered over my shoulder, still obsessing over this. She asked, though her tone was more curious than critical, "Jen, look at these numbers. In the past 4 years, we have paid Desert Verde Landscaping over $400,000. That's more than we spend on anything else, including our management company fees. Is that unusual? For a community of only 183 homes? Yeah, I think it might be. And every contract has been awarded to a company owned by the president of our board." Jennifer sat down across from me, her dark hair falling over one shoulder. "That does seem like a conflict of interest. What are you going to do about it?" "I am not sure yet, but something is not right here." Over the next week, I started digging deeper. I filed my formal request with Patricia to review the bid documents for the past year's worth of contracts. I also started talking to neighbors, casually at first, asking what they thought about the landscaping and the costs. Most people had not given it much thought. A few mentioned that their HOA fees had increased twice in the past 3 years, but they assumed that was just normal inflation. Then I met Donald Martinez at the community pool on a Saturday morning. Donald was a retired police detective who had moved to Meadowbrook Estates about 5 years ago. He was swimming laps when I arrived, and we struck up a conversation afterward. "You know, I voted against Richard Holloway the last time he ran for HOA president," Donald said, toweling off his gray hair. "Something about him rubbed me the wrong way. Too smooth, you know, like a car salesman. Did you ever notice anything specific? Anything that seemed off?" Donald looked at me carefully. "Why are you asking?" I explained my concerns about the landscaping contracts. Donald listened without interrupting, his cop instincts clearly still sharp despite retirement. "You think he is steering contracts to his own company?" Donald said when I finished. It was not a question. "I think it is possible, but I do not have proof yet, just a lot of coincidences." "Coincidences are just patterns we have not figured out yet," Donald said. "If you are serious about looking into this, you need to be careful. HOA boards have a lot of power, and people who are corrupt do not usually give up without a fight. I am just trying to look at the facts. Facts are good. Documentation is better. Make sure you keep records of everything." Patricia finally responded to my document request 2 weeks later, informing me that I could review the bid files during business hours at the HOA office. When I showed up the following Tuesday morning, she led me to a small room with a table and 3 cardboard boxes. "These are the bid files from the past year," she said. "You cannot remove anything from this room, and you cannot make copies without board approval. You can take notes by hand." "Can I take photos with my phone?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "No photographs. Those are the rules." I spent 4 hours going through those boxes. What I found was illuminating, though not in the way I expected. There were indeed multiple bids for each contract, usually 3 or 4 companies competing. But as I read through them, I noticed patterns that made my skin crawl. The competing bids all came from different companies: Sonoran Landscapes, Arizona Green Solutions, Premier Outdoor Services, and a few others. But the bid documents themselves had formatting inconsistencies that seemed odd. Some had typos that no professional company would make. Others had pricing that seemed deliberately high, almost as if they were designed to lose. I wrote down the names and contact information for all the competing companies, then thanked Patricia and left. That evening, I started making phone calls. The first number I tried for Sonoran Landscapes was disconnected. The second company, Arizona Green Solutions, had a working number, but when I asked to speak to someone about the bids they had submitted to Meadowbrook Estates HOA, the person who answered seemed confused. "We submitted a few bids to HOAs in the area last year, but I do not remember that specific community. Let me check our records and call you back," the man said. He never called back. I tried 3 more times over the next week, and could never get through to anyone who would talk to me about the bids. Premier Outdoor Services was even stranger. The address listed on their bid documents was a strip mall in Phoenix. When I drove there one afternoon, the suite number corresponded to a mailbox rental place. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time, watching people come and go from the businesses nearby. A phantom company. It had to be. Someone had created fake bids to make it look like there was legitimate competition, when in reality, the outcome was predetermined. But proving it was another matter entirely. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, which was held on a Thursday evening in late October. About 20 homeowners showed up, which was more than usual. Most meetings drew maybe a dozen people at most. Richard Holloway sat at the head of the table, flanked by Patricia in right and the other 3 board members. Sharon Kimball, the treasurer, Michael Chang, a member-at-large, and Linda Matthews, the vice president. Linda was the only one who ever seemed to question Richard's decisions, though she was usually outvoted. The meeting covered the usual business, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing a complaint about someone's unauthorized paint color, debating whether to upgrade the pool furniture. Then Richard moved to new business. "We need to discuss the contract for maintaining the common area landscaping next year," Richard said. "Our current contract with Desert Verde expires in December, and we should solicit bids for a new 3-year agreement." I raised my hand. Richard looked at me with barely concealed annoyance. "Yes, Bryan. I think we need to talk about the fact that Desert Verde has won every landscaping contract for the past 4 years, and you own Desert Verde. That seems like a serious conflict of interest." The room went silent. A few people shifted in their seats. Patricia's face turned red. Richard maintained his composure, though I saw his jaw tighten. "I appreciate your concern, Bryan, but everything we do is completely above board. We solicit multiple bids for every contract. Desert Verde wins because we provide the best value and quality. I recuse myself from the final vote each time. Recusing yourself from the vote does not eliminate the conflict of interest," I said. "You are still in a position to influence the process. You help write the request for proposals, you are present during the discussions, and your company always seems to win. Do not you think that looks bad?" "What looks bad is you making accusations without evidence," Patricia said, her voice sharp. "Richard has served this community faithfully for years. His company does excellent work. I am not making accusations. I am raising legitimate concerns that I think other homeowners share." Michael Chang spoke up. "Bryan, the board takes conflicts of interest very seriously. We follow all the procedures required by Arizona law and our governing documents. If you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, you should present it. Otherwise, this is not productive." Linda Matthews, to my surprise, said, "I think Bryan raises a fair point. Maybe we should consider having an independent audit of our contracting procedures, just to ensure everything is transparent." Richard turned to look at Linda with an expression I could not quite read. "An audit would be expensive and unnecessary. We already have annual financial audits conducted by our management company." "That is not the same as an independent forensic audit," I said. "And given the amounts of money involved, I think it would be worth the expense." "I will take it under advisement," Richard said in a tone that made it clear he would do no such thing. "Now, if there is no other business, I move to adjourn." The meeting ended shortly after. As people filed out, a few homeowners approached me. One was a woman named Sarah Chen who lived 3 streets over from me. "Thank you for speaking up," she said quietly. "I have wondered about those contracts too, but I did not want to cause trouble." "It is not causing trouble to ask questions," I replied. "In this HOA it is." Richard and Patricia control everything. They have been known to fine people aggressively if they get on their bad side. That comment stuck with me. After I got home, I started researching HOA law in Arizona. What I found was both enlightening and disturbing. Arizona revised statutes gave HOAs broad powers to levy fines, and even place liens on properties for violations of community rules. But those same statutes also required transparency in financial matters, and had specific prohibitions against self-dealing by board members. The problem was enforcement. Most homeowners had no idea what their rights were, and challenging an HOA board usually required hiring an attorney, which was expensive and time-consuming. The boards knew this, which gave them tremendous leverage to operate however they wanted. I needed help. the kind of help that went beyond my accounting skills and Donald Martinez's retired cop instincts. I started researching forensic auditors in the Phoenix area. Forensic accounting was a specialized field that combined accounting knowledge with investigative techniques, often used in fraud cases and legal disputes. After reading through several firm websites, I settled on one called Integrity Forensic Accounting. Their lead auditor was a woman named Dr. Rebecca Walsh, who had a PhD in accounting and 20 years of experience investigating financial fraud. I called their office and explained the situation to a receptionist, who scheduled a consultation for the following week. The initial consultation would cost $500, which would come out of my own pocket since the HOA board certainly was not going to authorize it. Dr. Walsh's office was in a professional building in downtown Phoenix. She was a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair, glasses, and a no-nonsense demeanor that I immediately appreciated. I spent an hour laying out everything I had discovered: the pattern of contracts, the suspicious bid documents, the phantom companies. She listened carefully, taking notes on a legal pad, asking clarifying questions here and there. "What you are describing sounds like a classic bid rigging scheme," she said when I finished. "The HOA president creates fake competing bids to make it look like there is a legitimate process, but in reality, his company was always going to win. He probably pockets the difference between what the work actually costs and what the HOA pays. Can you prove it? Possibly." A full forensic audit would require access to all the HOA's financial records, bank statements, vendor files, and email communications. I would need to verify whether those competing companies are legitimate, trace payment flows, and look for any kickbacks or other irregular transactions. It is complex work and it is not cheap. We are talking about $30,000 to $40,000 for a thorough investigation. I felt my stomach drop. I do not have that kind of money. Few individuals do. But here is what I suggest. You need to organize other homeowners who share your concerns. In Arizona, homeowners have the right to petition for a special meeting of the membership. If you can get 15% of the homeowners to sign a petition, you can force a special meeting. At that meeting, you can propose hiring an independent forensic auditor. If a majority of the homeowners vote for it, the HOA would have to pay for the audit using association funds. Will Richard just block it? He cannot if you follow the proper procedures. The law is on your side here, but you need to build support among your neighbors first. That is the hard part. I left her office feeling both energized and daunted. Organizing a grassroots campaign within an HOA was not something I had ever imagined doing. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. If Richard Holloway was stealing from the community, he needed to be stopped. Over the next month, I became someone I barely recognized. I went door to door throughout Meadowbrook Estates, talking to neighbors about the landscaping contracts and the need for transparency. Some people were supportive. Others were indifferent. A few were openly hostile, accusing me of stirring up trouble or having a personal vendetta against Richard. Donald Martinez became my most valuable ally. His credibility as a former detective helped convince skeptical homeowners that my concerns were legitimate. Sarah Chen also pitched in, using her connections in the neighborhood to set up small coffee meetings where I could present my case to groups of residents. We needed signatures from at least 28 homeowners to reach the 15% threshold. After 3 weeks of intensive effort, we had 32. I felt a sense of triumph as I submitted the petition to the HOA management company, citing the specific statute that required them to schedule a special meeting within 30 days. Richard was furious. He called me 2 days after I submitted the petition, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Bryan, I think you are making a huge mistake. You are damaging this community with these baseless accusations." "They are not baseless. I am asking for transparency. If there is nothing to hide, an audit will show that. An audit will cost tens of thousands of dollars that could be spent on actual improvements to the community. You are wasting everyone's time and money. Let the homeowners decide that at the special meeting." "You are going to regret this," he said, then hung up. That threat should have worried me more than it did. But I was too focused on preparing for the special meeting to think about what Richard might do in retaliation. The retaliation came a week later in the form of a certified letter from the HOA. I had been fined $500 for 6 separate violations of community rules. The violations included improper parking of my vehicle in my own driveway, failure to maintain my front yard landscaping to community standards, unauthorized modification to my house exterior, storing garbage cans visible from the street, and 2 other similarly petty complaints. Each violation came with photos taken from the street. My truck was parked in my driveway exactly as it had been for 2 years. My landscaping looked identical to dozens of other houses in the neighborhood. The unauthorized modification referred to a small solar light I had installed beside my front door. The garbage can violation was based on a photo taken on trash collection day when everyone's cans were at the curb. It was harassment, pure and simple, and I was not the only one. Donald Martinez received a similar letter. So did Sarah Chen and 3 other homeowners who had been vocal in supporting the petition. "This is retaliation," I told Jennifer that evening, waving the letter. "They are trying to intimidate us into backing down. Can they do that? Just fine you for made-up violations. They can try. But every one of these violations is either bogus or selectively enforced. Half the neighborhood has trucks in their driveways. I am going to fight these fines." I drafted a detailed response to each violation, including photos of my own and citations to the specific sections of the CC and Artiques that I argued made the fines invalid. I also filed a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which had jurisdiction over HOA disputes, alleging retaliatory enforcement. The special meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in mid-December. The HOA management company had to rent space at a local community center because they expected a large turnout. When Jennifer and I arrived 15 minutes before the meeting was supposed to start, the parking lot was already full. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a table where Richard and the other board members sat. I estimated over 100 homeowners had shown up, which was remarkable given that most monthly meetings drew barely a dozen. The meeting was called to order, and Richard gave a lengthy speech about his years of service to the community, the improvements made during his tenure, and the dangers of frivolous audits driven by personal vendettas. Then, it was my turn to speak. I walked to the front of the room, my heart pounding, and faced my neighbors. "I want to be clear about what we are asking for tonight," I began. "This is not about attacking anyone personally. This is about transparency and good governance. Over the past 4 years, our HOA has paid over $400,000 to a landscaping company owned by our HOA president. That company has won every single contract during that time period. When I asked to review the competing bids, I found irregularities that raised serious questions. Some of the competing companies appear to be fake. Others submitted bids that seemed designed to lose." I paused, looking around the room. People were listening intently. "An independent forensic audit will either confirm that everything was done properly, or it will reveal problems that need to be addressed," Either way, we will have answers. We will know the truth, and that is worth the cost. Several other homeowners spoke in favor of the audit. Donald Martinez gave a particularly compelling speech about accountability and the importance of checks and balances. Patricia Enright spoke against it, her voice rising as she accused me of wasting association resources on a witch hunt. Finally, it was time to vote. The management company had set up a ballot system, and homeowners filed to the back of the room to cast their votes. The tension in the room was palpable as the ballots were counted. When the results were announced, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The audit had been approved by a vote of 68 in favor, 42 against, with several abstentions. We had won. Richard's face was stone as he adjourned the meeting. He left quickly, not speaking to anyone. Patricia shot me a look of pure hatred as she gathered her papers. Over the next several weeks, Dr. Rebecca Walsh and her team began their forensic audit. The HOA board was legally required to provide access to all financial records, though Richard attempted to delay and obstruct the process at every turn. He claimed that certain documents were stored off-site and would take time to retrieve. He questioned whether the auditors had the authority to access email communications. He hired an attorney who sent threatening letters to Dr. Walsh's firm, but Dr. Walsh had dealt with obstruction before. She obtained a court order compelling the HOA to provide complete access to all records within 10 days. The attorney Richard hired backed down when faced with potential contempt charges. I tried to stay out of the way while the audit proceeded, though Dr. Walsh would occasionally call me with questions about specific transactions or contracts. She worked methodically, tracing every dollar that had gone to Desert Verde Landscaping over the past 5 years. In late February, nearly 3 months after the special meeting, Dr. Walsh called me to her office. She had completed her report. "You were right," she said, sliding a thick bound document across her desk to me. "Richard Holloway has been defrauding the HOA for years. The scheme was actually more sophisticated than I initially expected." She walked me through the findings. Richard had created 4 shell companies that existed only on paper: Sonoran Landscapes, Arizona Green Solutions, Premier Outdoor Services, and Desert Sun Landscaping. These companies had business licenses and tax ID numbers but no actual employees or equipment. For each contract, Richard would submit bids from these phantom companies along with his legitimate bid from Desert Verde. The phantom bids were always higher, ensuring Desert Verde won, but that was just the beginning. Dr. Walsh had discovered that the prices Desert Verde charged the HOA were inflated by an average of 40% compared to market rates for comparable work. Richard had been billing for services that were never performed, like monthly tree trimming that the trees showed no signs of receiving. He had charged for materials at hugely marked up prices, buying plants wholesale for $50 and billing the HOA for $300. The total fraud over 5 years came to approximately $328,000. "This is criminal fraud," Dr. Walsh said. "I am required by law to report this to the authorities. I will be sending a copy of my report to the Arizona Attorney General's office and to local law enforcement." I felt stunned, even though I had suspected something like this. Seeing it laid out in black and white was different. What happens now? That depends on the prosecutors. But based on the amount of money involved and the sophistication of the scheme, I would expect criminal charges. Wire fraud, theft, possibly racketeering if they can prove Patricia Enright or others were complicit. "You think Patricia was involved?" "I cannot prove it, but some of the emails I reviewed suggest she knew what was happening. At minimum, she was willfully blind. The same may be true for Sharon Kimball, the treasurer. She signed off on all these invoices without question. The audit report was presented to the full HOA membership at an emergency meeting in early March. The room was packed, and the mood was angry. When Dr. Walsh finished presenting her findings, several homeowners stood up and demanded Richard's immediate resignation from the board. Richard did not attend the meeting. His attorney sent a letter denying all allegations and claiming the audit was flawed and biased. But the evidence was overwhelming, and no one was buying his denials. The board voted unanimously to remove Richard as president and to file a civil lawsuit against him to recover the stolen funds. Patricia and Wright resigned from the board the same night, as did Sharon Kimball. Linda Matthews became the interim president. 3 weeks later, Richard Holloway was arrested at his home in Scottsdale. The local news covered it, showing footage of him being led out in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions. He was charged with 15 counts of fraud, theft, and forgery. Patricia and Wright was charged as an accessory after the fact. Sharon Kimball was not charged criminally, but faced a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty. The legal process moved slowly, as these things always do. Richard initially pleaded not guilty and vowed to fight the charges. His attorney argued that the billing practices were standard for the industry, and that any discrepancies were honest mistakes, not intentional fraud. But as discovery proceeded and more evidence came to light, his position became increasingly untenable. The prosecutor's office uncovered bank records showing Richard had used the fraudulently obtained funds to pay for a vacation home in San Diego, a boat, and private school tuition for his grandchildren. They found emails between Richard and Patricia discussing how to keep me and other homeowners from accessing certain records. In October, nearly a year after I first started investigating, Richard Holloway agreed to a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to 9 counts of fraud and was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. He was also ordered to pay full restitution of $328,000 to the HOA. Patricia and Wright pleaded guilty to obstruction and received 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. Sharon Kimball settled the civil case against her, agreeing to pay $50,000 from her personal assets. The money Richard was ordered to repay came from the forced sale of his assets, including his landscaping company, his properties, and his personal belongings. The HOA received about $210,000, with the remainder covered by insurance after a lengthy claim process. Throughout this ordeal, I learned more about HOA governance than I ever wanted to know. I learned about the power structures that can enable corruption, about the importance of transparency and accountability, and about how ordinary people can make a difference when they are willing to stand up for what is right. I also learned about the personal cost of fighting corruption. The stress took a toll on my marriage, though Jennifer and I worked through it. I received threatening phone calls and angry confrontations from Richard's supporters who thought I had destroyed a good man's life. My own legal fees for defending against the bogus HOA fines and dealing with various aspects of the case totaled nearly $8,000. But in the end, it was worth it. The new HOA board, which included Donald Martinez as president and myself as treasurer, implemented sweeping reforms. We adopted strict conflict of interest policies. We required competitive bidding from multiple verified companies for any contract over $5,000. We posted all financial information online in an easily accessible format. We limited board member terms to 2 years and required annual independent audits. The community itself seemed different after everything that happened. People were more engaged, more aware of what was happening in their HOA. Attendance at board meetings increased dramatically. Homeowners asked questions and demanded accountability. On a warm evening in April, nearly 18 months after I first noticed Richard shaking hands with the architectural review chairman, I sat on my back patio with Jennifer, watching the sun set over the mountains. Desert Verde Landscaping no longer existed. The company had been sold to a competitor who kept some of the employees but retired the name. Our new landscaping contract was with a company called Cactus Country Landscapes, chosen through a transparent bidding process that involved homeowner input. "Do you ever regret getting involved?" Jennifer asked, sipping her wine. I thought about that question carefully. "No, I mean it was hard. There were times I wanted to give up, but someone needed to do something. If it had not been me, would it have been anyone? Maybe eventually. Donald might have figured it out. Maybe. Or maybe Richard would have kept stealing for another decade. How much money would that have been?" Jennifer nodded, understanding. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of our neighborhood. Kids playing in a yard somewhere nearby, the distant hum of traffic, a dog barking. "The new board is doing good work," she said eventually. "I saw they finally approved the playground renovation that has been stuck for 3 years. Yeah, Linda is doing a great job as president. And having Donald's law enforcement background helps keep everyone honest. What about you? Are you going to run for president next election?" I laughed. "God, no. Treasurer is enough responsibility for me. I just want to make sure our finances are managed properly, and that we never end up in this situation again." The criminal trial, which took place over 3 weeks in September and October, had been emotionally draining. I testified for an entire day, walking the jury through how I first noticed the suspicious contracts, what I found in the bid documents, and how Richard had retaliated when I started asking questions. The prosecutor used my testimony to establish the timeline and show Richard's consciousness of guilt through his attempts to cover up the fraud. Richard's defense attorney tried to paint me as someone with a personal grudge, someone who was jealous of Richard's success or angry about some unrelated HOA dispute. But the financial evidence was too strong. Dr. Walsh's forensic analysis was meticulous and damning. The phantom companies, the inflated invoices, the fake bid documents, it all pointed to deliberate fraud. When the guilty verdict came back, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief that justice had been served. Anger at how much damage Richard had done. Sadness for his family, who were innocent victims of his greed. His wife had divorced him during the trial. His adult children would not speak to him. The judge, during sentencing, spoke directly to Richard. "You held a position of trust in your community. Your neighbors elected you to look after their interests, to manage their collective resources responsibly. Instead, you betrayed that trust for personal gain. You stole from them systematically over many years. The sentence I am imposing reflects the seriousness of your crimes and the need to deter others who might be tempted to abuse similar positions of authority." 6 years seemed like a long time, but part of me thought it was not enough. $328,000 stolen from 183 families. Some of those families were retirees on fixed incomes. Some were young couples struggling to make mortgage payments. Every one of them had paid higher HOA fees because of Richard's fraud. But the criminal justice system had done its job, and that was something. In many similar cases, particularly involving HOA fraud, the perpetrators faced only civil penalties or no consequences at all. The fact that Richard was actually going to prison sent a message to every other HOA board member in Arizona and beyond. This behavior will not be tolerated. In the months after the trial, I was contacted by homeowners from other communities in the Phoenix area who had similar suspicions about their own HOA boards. I shared what I learned, pointed them toward resources, and encouraged them to demand transparency. A few of those cases resulted in audits that uncovered fraud or mismanagement. Others found that their boards were actually operating properly, which provided peace of mind. I also heard from forensic auditors and attorneys who specialized in HOA law. Dr. Walsh told me that my case had become something of a teaching example in the forensic accounting community, a textbook illustration of how to investigate and document HOA fraud. Several law firms asked if I would be willing to serve as an expert witness or consultant in similar cases. I declined, wanting to return to a normal life, but I appreciated that our experience might help others. The civil lawsuit against Richard proceeded separately from the criminal case. The HOA's attorney filed claims for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, and unjust enrichment. They also went after the shell companies, though of course those had no real assets. The goal was to reach any remaining money Richard had hidden or to pierce corporate veils that might protect certain assets. That process revealed even more details about the scope of Richard's operation. He had been running similar schemes in 2 other HOA communities where Desert Verde did work, though he was not on those boards. The inflated billing and fake competing bids were part of his standard business model. Those communities eventually joined the lawsuit as co-plaintiffs. Recovering the money proved challenging despite the court judgment. Richard had spent lavishly, and many of his assets had depreciated or been sold at a loss. The vacation home in San Diego was underwater on its mortgage. The boat had been damaged in a storm and was worth less than he owed on it. His retirement accounts, which should have been substantial for someone his age, had been drained to pay for his lifestyle. The liquidation process took over a year. When all was said and done, Meadowbrook Estates received about $210,000 of the $328,000 owed. The insurance claim, filed under the HOA's directors and officers policy, covered most of the remaining loss after a lengthy dispute about whether the policy applied to intentional criminal acts by a board member. The insurance company eventually settled for $100,000, bringing the total recovery to $310,000. The missing $18,000, plus the substantial legal fees incurred during the investigation and litigation, meant the community was still out of pocket. But the new board decided not to raise fees to cover the shortfall, instead using reserve funds and implementing cost savings in other areas. We refinanced some debt at lower interest rates, renegotiated contracts with vendors, and found efficiencies in how we managed common areas. One unexpected benefit of the entire scandal was that it forced the community to take a hard look at all its operations. We discovered we were overpaying for pool maintenance, for insurance, and for management company services. By putting everything out for competitive bid, the same process we now required for landscaping, we saved nearly $40,000 annually. Those savings more than made up for the unrecovered fraud losses over time. I served as HOA treasurer for 2 years, then stepped down to let someone else take on the role. I had done what I set out to do: restore financial integrity and implement systems to prevent future fraud. Staying longer would just be ego, and I had learned during this experience that ego was often the enemy of good governance. Donald Martinez served a full term as president, then he too stepped down, joking that he had done his time in public service both as a cop and as an HOA president, and now he wanted to actually enjoy his retirement. The transition to new leadership was smooth, a sign that the reforms we implemented were working. I occasionally drove past the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates, where the renovation that started this whole thing had been completed. The landscaping looked beautiful, maintained by Cactus Country Landscapes at a price that was 30% lower than what Desert Verde had been charging. Palm trees swayed in the breeze, colorful desert flowers bloomed in neat beds, and a tasteful stone sign welcomed residents and visitors. It was hard to believe that just a few years ago, that same entrance had been the site of Richard Holloway's last contract award, the moment when something in my gut told me to start asking questions. If I had ignored that instinct, if I had just paid my HOA fees and minded my own business like so many homeowners do, Richard might still be running his scheme today. The experience changed me in ways I did not fully understand at first. I became more skeptical of authority, more willing to question things that did not make sense, more aware of how power could corrupt even in small ways. But I also became more hopeful about the capacity of ordinary people to create change when they worked together. Sarah Chen, who had been one of my earliest supporters, became a close friend. She eventually joined the HOA board herself and proved to be an excellent vice president, bringing energy and fresh ideas to the role. Donald Martinez and I had dinner together once a month, swapping stories about the investigation and trial, reflecting on lessons learned. Dr. Rebecca Walsh sent me a note after the trial concluded, thanking me for my cooperation and professionalism throughout the process. She told me that in her 20 years of forensic accounting, she had seen many cases where suspected fraud was real, but few where a single determined individual had made such a difference in bringing it to light. That note meant more to me than she probably realized. The media attention eventually faded, as it always does. Local news moved on to other scandals and stories. Richard Holloway became just another person who had committed fraud and gone to prison, his name appearing only in occasional searches when people researched HOA corruption in Arizona. But for the people who lived through it, who saw their community nearly destroyed by greed and corruption, who watched as justice was slowly but surely served, the experience left a lasting impact. We knew what was possible when people stood up for what was right. We understood the importance of transparency and accountability in every level of government, even something as small and seemingly insignificant as a homeowner association. Jennifer and I eventually moved out of Meadowbrook Estates, not because of any lingering problems, but simply because we wanted a bigger house when we decided to start a family. As we packed up our belongings and said goodbye to neighbors who had become friends, I felt a sense of closure. I had bought a house in a community, noticed something wrong, investigated it, and seen it through to the end. That journey had taken nearly 3 years from start to finish, consuming countless hours and causing immeasurable stress. But it had been worth every moment. On our last day in the house, Donald Martinez came by to help load some heavy furniture into the moving truck. We took a break in the afternoon, sitting on the back patio one last time with cold beers. "You know what the best part of this whole thing was?" Donald asked. "What's that?" "Proving that the system can work. I spent 30 years as a cop seeing cases get thrown out on technicalities, watching guilty people walk free, dealing with a justice system that felt broken more often than not. This case restored some of my faith. The investigation was solid. The prosecution did their job. The judge was fair. The jury got it right. Sometimes the system actually works the way it is supposed to." I nodded, understanding what he meant. And all because some nosy accountant decided to count how many landscaping contracts went to the HOA president's company. Donald laughed. Hey, nosy accountants are heroes in my book. You saw something wrong and you did not look away. That is more than most people can say. We finished our beers as the sun set one last time over the mountains, casting long shadows across the yard that would soon belong to someone else. I thought about Richard Holloway, sitting in a federal prison somewhere, probably bitter about being caught, probably convinced he had done nothing wrong. I thought about Patricia in Wright, completing her community service hours, her reputation destroyed. I thought about all the homeowners who had trusted them and been betrayed, but mostly I thought about the future, about the reforms that would prevent the next Richard Holloway from stealing from his community, about the homeowners who were more engaged and informed because of what happened, about the message sent to every HOA board in Arizona that fraud would not be tolerated. The moving truck was finally loaded as darkness fell. Jennifer came out to the patio, car keys in hand, ready to go. I took one last look around the yard, the house, the community where I had lived through one of the most intense experiences of my life. Yeah, I am ready. We drove away from Meadowbrook Estates that night, toward a new house in a new community, leaving behind both painful memories and profound pride in what had been accomplished. The forensic auditor had indeed ended Richard Holloway's career, but she had only been able to do that because someone noticed, because someone cared, because someone refused to accept that corruption was just the price of living in an HOA. As we merged onto the highway, Phoenix lights glittering in the distance, I felt Jennifer squeeze my hand. No more HOA investigations at the new place, okay? Let us just have a normal, boring experience this time. I laughed. Deal. Although if the president's contracting company starts winning every bid, I make no promises. She groaned, but she was smiling. We both knew that if I saw something wrong, I would not be able to ignore it. That was just who I had become through this experience. For better or worse, I was someone who counted the contracts, who asked uncomfortable questions, who believed that transparency and accountability mattered even in the smallest corners of civic life. Richard Holloway's landscaping company had won every contract for 4 years, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from the people who trusted him. But in the end, his greed had been his downfall. The forensic auditor had methodically documented every fraudulent transaction, every fake bid, every inflated invoice. The prosecutors had built an ironclad case. The jury had seen through his lies, and justice, slow and imperfect as it might be, had prevailed. That was the story I would tell when people asked what happened at my old HOA. Not a story of cynicism about how corruption always wins, but a story of hope about what is possible when ordinary people refuse to accept wrongdoing. A story about forensic accounting, community organizing, and the power of asking simple questions like, why does the president's company win every contract? The answer to that question had changed everything. It had exposed fraud, led to criminal convictions, restored financial integrity to a community, and reminded everyone involved that accountability matters. The forensic auditor had ended Richard Holloway's career, but the real victory belonged to everyone who demanded transparency and refused to look away when something did not add up. As we drove through the night toward our new home and new beginning, I felt grateful for the experience despite its difficulty. I had learned that one person could make a difference, that corruption could be fought and defeated, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply pay attention to what was happening in your own community. Those lessons would stay with me for the rest of my life, shaping how I engaged with the world and stood up for what I believed was right. The lights of Phoenix faded behind us, but the lessons of Meadowbrook Estates would never fade. They were part of me now, woven into how I understood civic responsibility and personal integrity. Richard Holloway was gone, his career destroyed by his own greed and the determined work of a forensic auditor who knew how to follow the money. But the community he tried to exploit survived, stronger and more vigilant than before. And that, in the end, was the only victory that really mattered.